The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Fallujah as Staff Sergeant Alexandra Alex Mitchell fought to stay conscious. Blood-herc blood had already soaked through her combat uniform, creating dark patches that spread like spilled ink across the desert camouflage. 6 bullet wounds marked her body, each one a testament to the hell that had erupted around her patrol just 40 minutes earlier. Yet her hands never stopped moving. Despite the searing pain, despite the blood loss that threatened to drag her into darkness, the 28-year-old combat medic continued working on Sergeant Thomas Walker's head wound with practiced precision. One hand maintained pressure on the compression bandage, while the other gripped her M9 sidearm, eyes constantly scanning for movement among the nearby buildings. The familiar weight of her medical bag, now torn and blood-spattered, rested against her side, a lifeline for the 2 wounded soldiers who depended entirely on her skills. Nearby, Private First Class Robert Davis lay unconscious, his mangled legs stabilized with a makeshift splint fashioned from debris and torn uniform pieces. Bullets pinged off the overturned Humvee that provided their only cover, the metallic impacts creating a deadly percussion that had become the soundtrack to their desperate situation. Through the haze of pain, Alex assessed their position with the clinical detachment that had been drilled into her through countless training exercises. 3 wounded soldiers, minimal medical supplies, enemy forces holding superior positions on 3 sides, no immediate extraction possible. The odds of survival diminished with each passing minute. "Still with me, Walker," she murmured, checking his pupils for signs of increasing intracranial pressure. The sergeant's eyes fluttered open, briefly unfocused, but responsive. A good sign amid countless bad ones. "No, you'd catch me if I fell," he whispered through cracked lips, attempting the ghost of a smile before slipping back into semi-consciousness. Alex allowed herself a moment, just a fraction of a second, to feel the crushing weight of their situation. Then, as she had been trained to do, she compartmentalized the emotion, locking it away where it couldn't interfere with the work that needed to be done. No one had ever survived 11 bullet wounds in combat with only field medicine. She was about to make history or die trying. 4 months earlier, Fort Sam Houston, Texas, gleamed under the harsh Texas sun. The sprawling military medical training facility bustled with activity as a new class of combat medics prepared for their final evaluation before deployment. Among them, Alexandra Mitchell stood out, not because she was one of the few women, but because her performance consistently topped the charts in every assessment. The training ground had been transformed into a simulated battlefield. Smoke machines created artificial fog, while speakers blasted recordings of gunfire explosions and screams. Mannequins with realistic wound configurations were scattered across the terrain, each representing a different medical challenge. Some would be salvageable. Others were designed to teach the hardest lesson of combat medicine, knowing when someone was beyond saving. Master Sergeant Frank Wilson watched from an elevated platform, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he observed the trainees rush into the chaos. At 58, the veteran of Desert Storm and numerous other conflicts had seen more death than most people could comprehend. His steel-gray hair was cut to regulation perfection, and his uniform bore the subtle signs of a man who considered military standards the minimum acceptable baseline. "Mitchell," he barked, his voice cutting through the simulated battlefield noise. "Your patient has a tension pneumothorax. What's your procedure?" Without hesitating, Alex demonstrated the proper technique for needle decompression on the mannequin's chest, explaining each step with confident precision. "Identify second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Swab with antiseptic. Insert 14-gauge needle perpendicular to chest wall. Listen for pressure release. Secure catheter." Wilson's expression remained impassive, but those who knew him well might have noticed the slight nod of approval. And if you don't have a proper decompression needle in your kit, improvise with available materials. For catheter without the plastic hub or modified ballpoint pen in extreme circumstances. Maintain sterile technique if possible, but prioritize airway and breathing over infection risk in immediate life-threatening scenarios. Her answer was textbook perfect, delivered without hesitation. It wasn't just memorization. Alex understood the principles behind the procedures. While other trainees might freeze when facing situations that deviated from standard protocols, she consistently demonstrated the ability to adapt. Later that afternoon, the training session moved to the classroom for the psychological preparation that was equally important for combat medics. Wilson paced before the group, his combat boots striking a measured rhythm against the polished floor. Let me be crystal clear about something, he said, stopping to survey the faces before him. Some of you won't make it through your first deployment without breaking. Not because you lack medical knowledge, but because you lack the mental fortitude required when everything goes to hell. His gaze lingered on Alex longer than the others. Mitchell, you've got the highest technical scores in the class, but out there, he gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the world beyond the training facility. Technical proficiency isn't enough. The battlefield doesn't care about your feelings, your fears, or your limitations. It certainly doesn't care that you're a woman. Alex met his gaze without flinching. With respect, Master Sergeant, the battlefield doesn't care about anyone's gender. It only cares if you can do the job. A tense silence followed. Several of the male trainees exchanged glances, waiting for Wilson's infamous temper to explode at what they perceived as insubordination. Instead, the corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. You're right, Mitchell. The battlefield doesn't discriminate. It tries to kill everyone equally. He resumed his pacing. That's why every one of you needs to understand what you're really training for. You're not just learning to save lives. You're learning to make impossible decisions under impossible conditions. The classroom fell silent as Wilson stopped again, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried more weight than his previous bark commands. The day will come when you have multiple casualties and insufficient resources, when you have to decide who might live and who will certainly die, when you have to work on a wounded soldier while taking fire yourself, when you have to continue treating patients despite your own injuries. No one moved. No one spoke. The air conditioning hummed in the background, a surreal counterpoint to the brutal reality Wilson was describing. Mitchell, you ever wonder why we push you harder than the others? Alex straightened in her seat. Because you're waiting for me to fail Master Sergeant. Wilson shook his head slowly. Because I know what's waiting for you out there, and it's worse than anything we can simulate here. He addressed the entire class again. Combat medicine isn't about being a hero. It's about doing your duty when everything in your body is screaming at you to run, hide, or freeze. The training session ended early that day when Wilson clutched his chest, suddenly his face contorting with pain as he collapsed to the floor. While other trainees froze in shock, uncertain if this was another training scenario, Alex moved instantly, her training overriding hesitation. He's in cardiac arrest, she announced after checking his pulse and immediately beginning chest compressions while directing others to call for emergency services and retrieve the AED from the wall. When the paramedics arrived minutes later, they found Alex still performing perfect CPR, maintaining the rhythm that kept blood flowing to Wilson's oxygen-starved brain. One of them later remarked that he'd rarely seen textbook CPR performed so flawlessly outside of a hospital setting, especially under stress. 3 days later, Wilson returned to the training facility against medical advice, his chest still tender from the fractured ribs, a common side effect of proper CPR. He found Alex cleaning equipment in the supply room. Mitchell, he said, his voice lacking its usual commanding edge. She stood immediately. Master Sergeant, you should be resting. The doctors tell me I'd be dead if you hadn't acted so quickly. He seemed uncomfortable with the admission. Perfect CPR technique, textbook AED application. Just doing my job, sir. Wilson studied her for a long moment, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. You know, I've been training combat medics for 15 years. Sent hundreds of them into war zones. Some come back with medals. Some come back in body bags. Some don't come back at all. Alex remained at attention, unsure where this conversation was heading. The ones who survive, who save lives under fire, they all have something I can't teach. Wilson tapped his temple. A certain wiring in the brain. When everything goes to hell, when normal people freeze or panic, they become more focused, more present. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. I saw it when you were working on me. Your hands weren't shaking. Your voice was steady. Your eyes were clear. I was scared, Alex admitted. But you didn't let fear stop you. That's the difference. Wilson handed her a small box. This belonged to my father. He was a medic in Korea, saved 37 men before a mortar took his leg. Inside the box was a weathered combat medical badge, its silver caduceus tarnished with age. I can't accept this, Alex began. You've already earned it, Wilson cut her off. Just make sure you stay alive long enough to wear it officially. For the first time since she'd known him, Wilson smiled a brief, almost grudging gesture. You're not just a good medic, Mitchell. You might be one of the great ones. 2 months into her deployment in Iraq, Alex had already established a reputation within Alpha Company. The 7 lives she'd saved each under difficult circumstances had earned her the respect of even the most skeptical soldiers. Captain Marcus Reynolds, the 35-year-old company commander, had taken to calling her the guardian angel during mission briefings. If you're stupid enough to get shot, he'd tell the men, just pray Mitchell gets to you first. The early November morning dawned with an oppressive heat that promised another blistering day in Fallujah. Operation Phantom Fury. The Second Battle of Fallujah was entering its critical phase with American forces clearing the city block by brutal block. Alpha Company had been tasked with securing the eastern sector, methodically sweeping through neighborhoods that intelligence reports claimed were being used as insurgent strongholds. In the temporary barracks, Alex methodically checked her medical supplies for the 3rd time that morning. Each item had its designated place in her aid bag: pressure dressings, hemostatic agents, tourniquets, airway management tools, IV supplies, and emergency medications. She added extra quick clot and an additional cat tourniquet exceeding the standard loadout. Experience had taught her that official guidelines rarely accounted for real-world chaos. Around her, the other members of Alpha Company prepared for the day's patrol with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had already seen their share of combat. Sergeant Thomas Walker, the 31-year-old weapons specialist, cleaned his M4 carbine with meticulous attention to detail, occasionally glancing at the photograph of his wife and infant daughter taped to the stock. "Got a feeling about today, Doc?" Walker asked, using the universal nickname for combat medics. Alex secured the final compartment of her medical bag. "Nothing specific, just the usual pre-mission jitters." Walker nodded. They both knew jitters was a sanitized term for the cold awareness of mortality that preceded every patrol. Neither was particularly superstitious, but both had seen enough combat to respect the value of intuition. "Wrote to Sarah last night," Walker said, referring to his wife. "Told her I'm thinking about opening that gun shop when I get back. Got it all planned out, location near Fort Hood, specialized inventory for military and law enforcement. Could use someone with medical training for the safety courses." It was a familiar conversation, soldiers discussing their after plans like talismans against the dangers that awaited them. Alex played her part in the ritual. "Sounds promising. I'm headed to medical school if I can get the scholarships lined up. Emergency medicine." "You'd be good at that," Walker said, and meant it. "Pressure doesn't break you. That's rare." Private First Class Robert Davis approached his youthful face, betraying the nervous energy of a relatively new addition to the company. At 25, he was older than many new enlistees, having worked in IT before patriotism and a sagging tech industry led him to the Army. "Briefing in 5, he announced, then lowered his voice. "Word is we've got actionable intelligence on a major weapons cache. Captain's pretty amped about it." Alex felt a familiar prickle of unease. "Source." Davis shrugged. "Above my pay grade, but apparently it came through one of those Iraqi informants the intel guys are always meeting with." The 3 of them made their way to the briefing area where Captain Reynolds was already spreading maps across the hood of a Humvee. Reynolds had the weathered look of a career soldier with sun-baked skin and eyes that had seen too much over too many deployments. His previous tour in Somalia during Operation Gothic Serpent had given him a healthy skepticism about intelligence reports and a near-religious devotion to thorough planning. "Listen up," he said as the team gathered around. "We've received information about a significant weapons cache in this compound." He pointed to a 2-story structure on the eastern edge of their assigned sector. "Intel suggests it's being used to store RPGs, mortars, and materials for IEDs." Alex studied the satellite imagery, noting the building's location relative to surrounding structures. Isolated position, limited cover on approach. Lots of potential sniper positions in those taller buildings to the north and west. Reynolds nodded, appreciating her tactical assessment. "That's why we're bringing extra firepower. Lawson will man the 50 cal on the lead vehicle. Bennett will provide overwatch from the rear position." Sergeant Eric Lawson, the 29-year-old heavy weapons specialist, grinned with satisfaction. The M250 caliber machine gun was his preferred instrument, capable of delivering devastating firepower against both personnel and light vehicles. Private First Class Michael Bennett, the unit's designated marksman, checked the scope on his M110 semi-automatic sniper system. At 23, he was the youngest member of the team, but his extraordinary eyesight and steady hands made him invaluable for identifying distant threats. "Timeline," Walker asked. "We roll out in 30, Reynolds replied. "Standard 3-vehicle convoy. First vehicle provides overwatch, second and third for the search team. Mitchell, you're with me in Vehicle 2. Walker, you've got point in Vehicle 1. Davis handles communications in Vehicle 3. Alex raised her hand. Sir, Intel Source Reliability Assessment. Reynolds' expression tightened slightly. Classified as generally reliable with some inconsistencies. Best we've got right now. Feels too clean, Alex said, unable to suppress the concern that had been building since she first heard about the mission. Lawson snorted. Getting cold feet, Mitchell. We can find you a nice desk job back at base if you're scared. Enough, Reynolds cut in sharply. Mitchell's instincts have saved lives before. We acknowledge the concern and proceed with elevated caution. He looked directly at Alex. That said, we have our orders. The weapons in that compound could be used to kill a lot of our people if we don't secure them. Alex nodded, accepting the reality of their situation. Her job wasn't to make strategic decisions, but to keep everyone alive when those decisions led to inevitable violence. Gear up, Reynolds concluded, and stay frosty out there. I want everyone coming back in one piece. As the team dispersed to make final preparations, Walker fell into step beside Alex. That feeling getting any stronger? He asked quietly. Like a thunderstorm building, she admitted. Something's not right about this one. Walker checked that no one else was within earshot. I trust your instincts more than some anonymous informant. I'll keep extra eyes out, make sure the boys stay sharp. Thanks, Tom. He gave her shoulder a brief squeeze, a gesture of solidarity that would have been unthinkable during her first weeks with the unit. That's what family does, Doc. The convoy rolled through the dusty streets of Fallujah under a merciless sun that seemed to bleach all color from the world. 3 armored Humvees moved in tight formation, their reinforced hulls offering some protection against the ever-present threat of improvised explosive devices. The M1151 variant they used featured additional armor plating and ballistic glass improvements born from the blood of earlier casualties in the war. From her position in the second vehicle, Alex observed the passing landscape with the heightened awareness that came with potential danger. The city showed the unmistakable scars of urban warfare, bullet-riddled walls, collapsed structures, and the occasional burned-out car. Yet amid the destruction, life continued with stubborn persistence. Iraqi civilians moved cautiously through side streets, carrying on with daily routines despite the military presence. Something felt off. The usual patterns were disrupted in ways subtle enough that someone without combat experience might miss them entirely. Where are all the kids? She murmured, mostly to herself. Reynolds, seated beside her, picked up on her concern immediately. What do you mean? This neighborhood usually has children playing in the streets, even with our patrols. And the market 2 blocks back should be busy this time of day. Reynolds keyed his radio. All units increase awareness level, possible environmental anomalies. Through the bulletproof window, Alex noticed other details that intensified her unease. Storefront shutters closed despite the business hour. Men exchanging glances as the convoy passed. The absence of women hanging laundry or carrying groceries. Sir, she said, I think we're driving into... The radio crackled with Bennett's voice from the rear vehicle. Movement on rooftops, 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock positions. Multiple military-age males with possible spotting equipment. Acknowledge, Reynolds responded. Maintain course, but prepare for potential contact. Lawson, keep that 50 ready. The lead Humvee slowed as they approached the target compound, a 2-story concrete structure surrounded by a low wall. The satellite imagery hadn't captured recent modifications, new concertina wire atop the wall, and freshly installed metal shutters over the windows. Alex's eyes were drawn to the dirt road leading to the compound entrance. The surface showed subtle irregularities, recently disturbed soil that had been hastily camouflaged to match the surrounding terrain. IED, she shouted, recognizing the telltale signs from previous patrols. The road's been... Her warning came too late. A massive explosion erupted beneath the lead Humvee, lifting the armored vehicle several feet into the air before it crashed back down onto its side. The thunderous blast was immediately followed by the distinctive crack of rifle fire from multiple positions. Contact! 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 Reynolds shouted into the radio as bullets began striking their vehicle. All units, we are under attack from multiple directions. The carefully planned operation dissolved into chaos as insurgent fighters opened fire from concealed positions throughout the neighborhood. Windows that had seemed empty now blazed with muzzle flashes. Rooftops that had appeared clear now hosted snipers with devastating fields of fire. It's an ambush. Alex realized the thunderstorm feeling now crystallized into certainty. The weapons cache was bait. Reynolds was already coordinating a defensive position, directing the 3rd vehicle to provide covering fire while calling for immediate backup. Mitchell, stay down. Walker's team needs immediate medical support, but we need to suppress this fire first. Alex watched in horror as the overturned lead Humvee began taking concentrated small arms fire. Walker and his team were trapped inside the twisted metal, injured from the blast, and now pinned down by the intensifying attack. They won't last that long, she said, already gathering her medical bag. I'm going now. Reynolds grabbed her arm. That's suicide, Mitchell. Wait for suppressing fire. Alex met his gaze with calm certainty. Respectfully, sir, that's not an option for the wounded. I took an oath. Before Reynolds could respond, a voice crackled over the enemy communication frequency. They were monitoring speaking perfect English with the unmistakable accent of someone educated in Western military academies. Target the female medic first, the voice instructed. No medical support means no survivors. Reynolds' expression hardened as he recognized the implication. They've studied our unit. They know exactly who you are and what you do. Then they should know I'm very good at my job, Alex replied, checking her sidearm. Cover me as best you can, sir. Without waiting for permission, Alex opened the vehicle door and launched herself into the maelstrom of combat. The 50 meters between her position and the overturned Humvee might as well have been 50 miles. Every inch was exposed to enemy fire from multiple angles. Time seemed to slow as her combat training took over. She moved in an irregular pattern, making herself a difficult target while keeping low to minimize her profile. Bullets kicked up dust around her feet and whizzed past her head, but she maintained her focus on the objective to reach Walker and the others before it was too late. From his position in the third vehicle, Bennett provided what covering fire he could with precision shots at visible insurgents. Lawson, despite his earlier mockery, unleashed a barrage from the mounted weapon on their vehicle, temporarily suppressing some of the enemy positions. Alex was halfway to the overturned Humvee when she heard Walker's voice calling weakly from within the wreckage. The knowledge that at least one soldier remained alive redoubled her determination. 20 meters from the target, she spotted an insurgent fighter moving to a flanking position with a clear line of sight to her approach. In one fluid motion, she dropped to one knee, drew her sidearm, and fired twice. The insurgent fell, his attack thwarted by her unexpected accuracy. Lawson's voice came through her earpiece, genuine surprise evident in his tone. Damn, Mitchell. Didn't know you could shoot like that. There's a lot you don't know about me, she replied, resuming her advance. 10 meters from the Humvee, disaster struck. A hidden sniper positioned in a building to the northeast fired a single precisely aimed shot. The bullet struck Alex in the right shoulder, spinning her around with the impact. Pain exploded through her body as the 7.62 millimeter round tore through muscle and tissue, narrowly missing her brachial artery. For a moment, she staggered, nearly dropping to her knees as the shock of the injury registered. Blood immediately began soaking through her uniform, and her right arm hung momentarily useless at her side. In that critical instant, two paths lay before her: retreat to safety or continue the advance despite her injury. For Alexandra Mitchell, there was never truly a choice. Gritting her teeth against the pain, she shifted her medical bag to her left shoulder and pressed forward, her determination hardening into something beyond ordinary courage. When she finally reached the overturned Humvee, she pressed herself against its exposed undercarriage, using the vehicle's bulk as cover from the worst of the enemy fire. Walker, she called. Can you hear me? A weak groan answered from inside. Alex quickly assessed the situation. The blast had crumpled one side of the vehicle, but the reinforced crew compartment had mostly held its shape, protecting the occupants from immediate death. However, the Humvee now rested on its side, with the exit points either crushed or exposed to enemy fire. I'm coming in, she announced, identifying a small gap where the rear door had been partially torn from its hinges. Bullets continued to strike the vehicle's armor, creating a constant metallic drumbeat that underscored the desperate nature of their situation. Ignoring the burning pain in her shoulder, Alex squeezed through the opening into the darkened interior of the Humvee. The scene inside confirmed her worst fears. Walker lay unconscious, blood streaming from a severe head wound where he'd struck the interior during the explosion. The vehicle's driver, Private Jenkins, was already dead, his body crushed by the steering column. In the rear compartment, she found Davis trapped under a collapsed equipment rack, his right leg bent at an impossible angle with bone protruding through torn uniform fabric. He was conscious but in shock, his eyes wide with pain and fear. Doc, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the continuing gunfire outside. We walked right into it, didn't we? Save your strength, Alex replied, immediately going to work despite her own injury. She stabilized Walker's cervical spine and applied a pressure dressing to his head wound, working by touch and training when the limited light made visual assessment difficult. Outside, the radio chatter indicated that the ambush was even more extensive than initially thought. Multiple insurgent teams had coordinated their attack with professional precision, establishing interlocking fields of fire that prevented any easy escape. Reynolds and the remaining soldiers were pinned down, unable to mount an effective counterattack without reinforcements. Alex heard a distinctive voice issuing commands in Arabic, followed by English translations for fighters who apparently came from various backgrounds. The tactical sophistication confirmed her suspicion that this was no ordinary insurgent group. Majid, take your team to the west approach. Cohen maintains suppressing fire on their position. Do not allow the medic to evacuate casualties. Working quickly, Alex freed Davis from the equipment, pinning him down, applying a tourniquet to his severely damaged leg. The young soldier bit back a scream as she manipulated the limb, securing it with an improvised splint. I need to get you both out of here, she explained, administering morphine to manage Davis's pain. Walker needs immediate evacuation for his head injury, and you're at risk of catastrophic blood loss if that tourniquet doesn't hold. Davis grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. They're waiting for you out there, Doc. That voice on the radio, he knows exactly who you are. Then he should know better than to get between a medic and her patients, Alex replied with grim determination. After ensuring both men were stable enough for movement, she began the arduous process of extracting them from the wreckage. Walker, still unconscious, had to be moved with extreme caution to prevent further spinal injury. Using her body as a shield, Alex gradually maneuvered him toward the gap she'd entered through. Reynolds' voice crackled over her radio. Mitchell status report. 2 alive. When KI, she responded tersely. Walker has severe head trauma, probable TBA. Davis has compound fracture of the right femur with significant blood loss. Both need immediate evacuation. Roger that. We're calling in air support, but it's at least 30 minutes out. Can you hold position? Alex glanced at Walker's pallid face. Negative. Walker won't last 30 minutes without advanced intervention. I'm extracting them now. That's suicide, Mitchell. The enemy has clear lines of fire to your position. Then I suggest you give them something else to shoot at, sir. There was a brief pause before Reynolds responded. Understood. Preparing suppressive fire on my mark. 3, 2, 1 mark. The area erupted with renewed gunfire as the remaining American forces unleashed everything they had at the insurgent positions. The diversionary tactic provided a brief window of opportunity that Alex didn't waste. With strength born of desperation and training, she dragged Walker's unconscious form through the gap in the Humvee's frame, positioning him in the relative shelter provided by the vehicle's undercarriage. Returning immediately for Davis, she helped him crawl through, despite his agonized gasps as the movement jostled his shattered leg. Just as she got both men situated in the marginally safer position behind the overturned Humvee, the suppressive fire from her unit began to slacken as ammunition ran low. The insurgents, recognizing the shift, intensified their attack. A barrage of bullets struck around their position, sending fragments of metal and concrete flying in all directions. Alex instinctively threw herself over Walker's exposed head wound, shielding him with her body. White-hot pain exploded through her left thigh as a second bullet found its mark, tearing through muscle and narrowly missing her femoral artery. The impact knocked her sideways, momentarily disrupting her concentration as blood began pooling beneath her. Doc, Davis cried out, witnessing the hit. Alex gritted her teeth, pushing through the pain to assess her new injury. The bullet had passed through cleanly, a mixed blessing that meant both an exit wound to manage, but no embedded projectile to cause further damage. With practiced movements that belied her increasing blood loss, she applied a combat tourniquet to her own thigh, tightening it until the bleeding slowed to a manageable seep rather than the pulsing flow that would indicate arterial damage. I'm fine, she lied, turning her attention back to Walker's deteriorating condition. His pupils showed signs of increasing intracranial pressure, a life-threatening development that required immediate intervention. As she worked to stabilize her patients, the enemy voice returned on the captured radio frequency, speaking with chilling confidence. The female medic is wounded but still operating. Focus fire on her position. No survivors, that's the mission. Through the haze of pain and professional focus, Alex recognized the significance of those words. This wasn't just an opportunistic ambush. It was a planned operation with specific objectives, and somehow she had become a primary target. A third bullet struck her as she leaned over to adjust Walker's airway, this one tearing through her left side just below the ribs. The impact drove the air from her lungs and sent her sprawling onto her back, momentarily paralyzed by the shock of the new wound. Davis, despite his own grievous injury, dragged himself toward her. "Doc, stay with us." The world seemed to waver and darken around the edges as Alex fought to remain conscious. Blood loss, shock, and pain threatened to overwhelm her, carefully maintained professional detachment. For a brief, terrifying moment, she felt herself slipping toward unconsciousness, a surrender that would mean death for all three of them. Then, from some deep reservoir of will, Alexandra Mitchell found the strength to push back against the encroaching darkness. Her father's voice seemed to echo in her memory. "Mitchells don't quit, not ever." With trembling hands, she pressed a hemostatic dressing against her newest wound, the advanced clotting agents immediately beginning to work against the blood flow. The pain was indescribable, but she compartmentalized it, forcing her mind to focus on the immediate tasks rather than the agony coursing through her body. "Davis," she gasped, "need you to keep pressure on Walker's head dressing. Can you do that?" The wounded soldier nodded grimly, dragging himself closer to follow her instructions. Alex keyed her radio, her voice remarkably steady despite her injuries. "Captain, situation deteriorating. 3 gunshot wounds sustained but still operational. Walker and Davis stable but critical. Request immediate fire mission on building to our northeast sniper position, confirmed." Reynolds' voice returned tight with concern. "Mitchell, your vital signs are redlining on our tactical monitor. Fall back to our position immediately." "Negative, sir. Patients can't be moved without additional support." She paused, taking a shuddering breath as pain lanced through her side. "Besides, I'm not sure I can make it back across that open ground now." The honest assessment hung in the air for a long moment before Reynolds responded. "Understood, maintaining position and continuing to coordinate reinforcements." "Hold on, Mitchell, that's an order." "Always do, sir," she replied, allowing herself a grim smile that no one could see. As the sun climbed higher in the Fallujah sky, Alexandra Mitchell continued working despite injuries that would have incapacitated most soldiers. 3 bullet wounds leaked blood onto the dusty ground beneath her, yet her hands remained steady as she monitored her patients' vital signs and adjusted their treatment. The battle raged around their precarious position with insurgent fighters, attempting to maneuver closer, while the remaining American forces fought desperately to keep them at bay. It was a deadly stalemate that could only end when one side received reinforcements, and in this isolated sector of Fallujah, surrounded by enemy forces, the odds heavily favored the insurgents. Through it all, Alex maintained her focus on the oath she had taken to preserve life in the face of death, to bring healing amid destruction, to never abandon those who depended on her skills. She had already been shot 3 times, and before this day ended, that number would more than triple. But Alexandra Mitchell wasn't done fighting. Not by a long shot. Blood pooled beneath Staff Sergeant Alexandra Mitchell as she worked with methodical precision despite the 3 bullet wounds that had already torn through her body. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the overturned Humvee that provided their only cover, transforming the shattered vehicle into an oven of twisted metal. Sweat mingled with blood dripping into her eyes as she monitored Sergeant Walker's deteriorating neurological signs. "Davis," she called to the wounded soldier beside her, "I need you to keep talking to him. Name unit anything to stimulate response." Davis, pale from blood loss and shock, nodded weakly. His shattered leg was stabilized with an improvised splint, but Alex knew the tourniquet could only remain in place for a limited time before tissue death became irreversible. Each passing minute brought them closer to medical decision points no field medic should have to make. The radio crackled with Captain Reynolds' voice. "Mitchell, sit rep." Alex pressed her hand against her side wound, wincing as fresh pain shot through her torso. "Walker's intracranial pressure is increasing. Davis is stable but critical. Enemy fire still too heavy for extraction." What she didn't say was equally important. Without advanced medical intervention, soon Walker would likely suffer permanent brain damage or death. Without surgical repair of his vascular injuries, Davis might lose his leg. Without treatment for her own wounds, she would eventually succumb to blood loss. The tactical situation offered little hope. The insurgent forces had established overlapping fields of fire from multiple buildings surrounding their position. Any movement immediately drew precisely aimed shots that suggested professional military training rather than the haphazard techniques of typical insurgent fighters. Through her earpiece, Alex heard enemy communications continuing in that eerily confident, English-accented Arabic. The voice belonged to someone clearly educated in Western military academies, someone who understood American tactical doctrine and could anticipate their responses. "Maintain containment," the voice instructed. "No need to rush. They're cut off with multiple casualties. Time is on our side. The cold calculation in those words sent a chill through Alex despite the blistering heat. This wasn't a random ambush. It was a meticulously planned trap specifically designed to target their unit. And for some reason, the enemy commander had specifically identified her as a priority target. A sudden movement caught her attention. Walker's eyes had opened, though his gaze remained unfocused. "What happened?" He mumbled the words, slurring together. "IED took out our vehicle," Alex explained, keeping her voice calm and professional. "You've got a head injury. Need you to stay still while we wait for extraction." Walker's eyes struggled to focus on her blood-soaked uniform. "You're hit." "Just a scratch," she lied. "Nothing serious." "Liar," he whispered with the ghost of a smile. "Always the worst patient." Alex managed a small smile in return. "Takes one to know one. Now conserve your strength." She turned her attention to checking Davis's condition, stretching across the small space behind the overturned Humvee. The movement exposed her momentarily just enough for the hidden sniper who had been patiently waiting for precisely such an opportunity. The fourth bullet caught her in the back, punching through body armor that had already been compromised by earlier hits. White-hot agony exploded through her chest as the round penetrated her right lung before exiting below her collarbone. The impact drove her forward onto her hands and knees, blood immediately bubbling from her lips as her damaged lung began to fill with fluid. "Doc," Davis cried out, witnessing the hit. For several seconds, Alex couldn't speak. Couldn't even breathe as the sucking chest wound disrupted the pressure differential needed for respiration. Training overrode panic as her hands moved automatically, fumbling for the chest seal in her medical kit. With trembling fingers, she applied the specialized dressing over the exit wound, creating an improvised one-way valve that would allow air to escape without entering the pleural space. The procedure, while textbook perfect in execution, was performed through a haze of pain that threatened to overwhelm her consciousness. Each labored breath produced an audible bubbling sound as air escaped around the bullet's path through lung tissue. "Mitchell," Reynolds' voice came through the radio with urgency. "Your vitals just crashed. Report status." "GSW to right thoracic cavity," she managed between gasping breaths. "Tension pneumothorax developing, self-treated with chest seal." The clinical description did little justice to the reality without proper medical intervention. The progressive collapse of her lung would eventually lead to respiratory failure and death. Alex knew the grim prognosis better than anyone, yet her focus remained fixed on her patients rather than her own deteriorating condition. With mechanical precision, she reached for her emergency kit and located a 14-gauge needle. What she was about to attempt was a procedure normally reserved for hospital settings, but field conditions offered no alternatives. "Davis," she gasped, "need your help. Needle decompression." The wounded soldier stared at her in horror. "Doc, I'm not trained for—" "I'll talk you through it," she interrupted, her voice strengthening with professional detachment despite the blood still seeping from her lips. "Right side second, intercostal space, mid-clavicular line." She guided Davis's shaking hands as he performed the emergency procedure, inserting the needle into her chest wall to release the trapped air compressing her lung and heart. The immediate relief as pressure diminished was tempered by the knowledge that this was merely a temporary solution. "Good job," she told Davis when the procedure was complete. "You've got steady hands." "Learn from the best," he replied, his voice cracking with emotion. Before she could respond, the enemy voice returned on their captured radio frequency. "The female medic is still operating despite multiple hits. Impressive. Adjust fire to target center mass. We need to eliminate their medical capability." Captain Reynolds' voice cut in immediately. "Mitchell, they're specifically targeting you. We need to create a diversion to get you out of there." Alex checked Walker's pupils, unequal and sluggishly reactive, indicating worsening brain injury. "Negative. Patient still non-ambulatory. Cannot abandon position." "That wasn't a request, Staff Sergeant. That's an order." "With respect, sir," she replied, injecting a formal tone that she rarely used with Reynolds. "Medical triage supersedes tactical retreat in this scenario. These men will die without continuous care." The silence that followed conveyed Reynolds' frustration, but also his understanding. They both knew the Warriors' code that bound their unit together: no one gets left behind. "Roger that," he finally responded. "Reinforcements still inbound but delayed by fighting in other sectors. Entire city's gone hot. Looks like a coordinated offensive." The revelation confirmed Alex's earlier suspicions. Their ambush was part of a larger operation targeting American forces throughout Fallujah. The professional precision of the attack, the English-speaking commander, the specific targeting of medical personnel, all pointed to something beyond typical insurgent capabilities. The fifth bullet caught her before she could process these implications, striking her left arm with enough force to spin her sideways. Bones shattered on impact as the high-velocity round created a temporary wound cavity that displaced tissue and nerve bundles before exiting. The limb immediately went numb, then erupted in searing pain as severed nerve endings began firing chaotic signals. Alex bit back a scream, a coppery taste of blood filling her mouth as she fought to maintain consciousness. 5 gunshot wounds now marked her body, each one leaking precious blood onto the dusty ground beneath the Humvee's shadow. Most soldiers would have been incapacitated by a single such injury. 5 represented catastrophic trauma that should have rendered her combat ineffective. Yet Alexandra Mitchell continued functioning through a combination of training determination and physiological resilience that defied medical explanation. Working one-handed now, she secured her shattered left arm against her body, using a field dressing, creating a makeshift sling that minimized movement of the fractured bones. Doc Walker whispered, his moments of lucidity becoming less frequent as intracranial pressure continued building within his skull. "You need to leave us. Save yourself." Alex met his gaze with unwavering resolve. "Not happening, Sergeant." "That's an order." A ghost of a smile crossed her blood-flecked lips. "Medics outrank everyone when it comes to medical decisions. You taught me that, remember?" Walker's eyes closed again as he slipped back into unconsciousness. The brief exchange had cost him precious energy, but Alex knew the psychological value of human connection in combat scenarios. Even severely wounded soldiers fought harder to survive when they didn't feel abandoned. The afternoon heat intensified, adding dehydration to their mounting challenges. Alex's remaining functional hands shook slightly as she checked Davis's tourniquet, adjusting it to maintain circulation without allowing catastrophic bleeding to resume. Her medical training emphasized the delicate balance. Too tight for too long would result in tissue death, impossible amputation. Too loose would allow bleeding that could kill him before help arrived. "How bad is it really, Doc?" Davis asked, watching her face with the intensity of someone trying to read their own prognosis. "The leg compound, femoral fracture with vascular compromise. Serious but survivable with proper surgical intervention." She maintained her clinical detachment, knowing that false hope was as dangerous as no hope at all. "No," Davis clarified. "I mean you. How bad are you hit?" Alex paused, considering how much truth to share. 5 GSWs, shoulder, thigh, side, back with lung involvement, and now arm. Significant blood loss, but all major arteries intact. "Jesus, Doc," he whispered. "How are you even conscious?" She shrugged her good shoulder, immediately regretting the movement as pain lanced through her torso. "Stubborn, I guess. My old man used to say Mitchells have hard heads and hearts to match." Their conversation was interrupted by renewed enemy fire, this time concentrated on Reynolds' position. Through her radio, Alex heard the unmistakable sounds of close-quarter combat, shouted commands. The distinctive report of M4 carbines on 3-round burst the deeper percussion of Lawson's .50 caliber. "Contact, contact," Reynolds shouted. "Enemy forces attempting to flank eastern approach." Alex instinctively reached for her sidearm, checking that it was loaded and ready. With her left arm useless and her right weakened by the shoulder wound, her shooting ability was severely compromised, but she would defend her patient as if the enemy breached their position. The firefight intensified for several minutes before Reynolds' voice returned, breathless but steady. "Perimeter secure. They tested our defenses, probing for weaknesses." "Casualties?" Alex asked immediately. "Negative. 1 minor shrapnel injury. Bennett took out their team leader with a beautiful 600-meter headshot. Bought us some breathing room." The momentary victory did little to change their strategic situation, but tactical successes could accumulate into survival opportunities. Alex allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope before the rational part of her medical training reasserted control. Walker's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Without neurosurgical intervention, soon permanent damage was inevitable. She keyed her radio. "Captain Walker needs immediate evacuation. His Glasgow coma scale is dropping by the minute." "Understood. Air assets are tied up across the city. We're working on a ground extraction plan, but the approaches are still too hot." Alex closed her eyes, briefly calculating timeframes against probable outcomes. Walker had perhaps 2 hours before the increasing intracranial pressure caused irreversible brain damage. Davis could maintain his current condition longer with proper tourniquet management, but infection risks increased with every hour his open fracture remained untreated. As for her own injuries, she pushed that assessment aside. Her survival was secondary to her professional responsibilities. The sound of her name being discussed on the enemy communication channel drew her attention back to the radio. The female medic is Staff Sergeant Alexandra Mitchell, the English accented voice informed his fighters. Intelligence confirms she has saved 17 coalition soldiers during previous engagements. High-value medical target. A second voice responded in Arabic accented English. She should be dead already. We've confirmed 5 direct hits. Yet she continues operating, the commander replied. Admirable resilience. Nevertheless, neutralize her, and the wounded will die naturally. The cold calculation in those words sent a surge of anger through Alex, momentarily overpowering the pain of her wounds. These weren't just insurgents fighting occupation forces. They were deliberately targeting medical personnel as a tactical strategy, a direct violation of the laws of warfare and basic human decency. Her indignation was interrupted by a new development. Walker began experiencing seizures, his body convulsing despite her attempts to stabilize him. The neurological crisis confirmed her worst fears about his deteriorating condition. Without immediate medical intervention, he would die within the hour. Working one-handed with supplies depleted by her own injuries, Alex managed to administer anti-seizure medication from her emergency kit. The convulsions gradually subsided, but Walker's breathing became increasingly irregular, another ominous sign of advancing brain injury. Davis, she said, her voice tight with controlled urgency, I need you to help me position him. We need to elevate his head slightly to help reduce intracranial pressure. Despite his own injuries, Davis dragged himself closer following her instructions with remarkable composure for a soldier facing his first major combat casualty scenario. Together, they adjusted Walker's position using pieces of equipment to create the optimal angle for reducing pressure on his brain. As they worked, Alex felt herself growing lightheaded, the cumulative effect of blood loss, dehydration, and developing shock. The world seemed to waver at the edges of her vision, objects losing definition as her body approached its physiological limits. Not yet, she thought fiercely. Not while they still need me. Through sheer force of will, she pushed back against the encroaching darkness, forcing her medical training to override her body's desperate signals to shut down and conserve resources. Each movement sent fresh waves of agony through her multiple wound sites, but she compartmentalized the pain, relegating it to a distant awareness that couldn't interfere with her duties. The radio crackled again with Reynolds' voice. Mitchell, we've got confirmation of significant enemy reinforcements moving into the area, at least 30 fighters with heavy weapon support. The tactical situation, already dire, had just become potentially catastrophic. Their unit was outnumbered, outgunned, and divided by enemy fire zones that prevented consolidation of forces. Understood, she replied, her voice remarkably steady despite her condition. Recommendations, sir. There was a pause before Reynolds answered, the hesitation betraying the gravity of their situation. We're going to attempt a coordinated breakout. Bennett has identified a potential corridor on the western approach that shows minimal enemy activity. If we concentrate fire on their eastern positions as a diversion, we might be able to reach your position and extract all of you. The plan was tactically sound, but relied on assumptions about enemy positioning that could prove fatal if incorrect. Alex considered their dwindling alternatives and recognized that waiting for external reinforcements was becoming increasingly unlikely as fighting engulfed the entire city. Roger that. We'll be ready. She checked her sidearm again, counting the remaining ammunition. 7 rounds, not enough to provide meaningful covering fire during an extraction attempt, but perhaps enough to defend her patience if enemy fighters breached their position. As the sun began its westward descent, casting longer shadows across the bullet-scarred street, Alex noticed changes in Walker's breathing pattern, irregular gasps followed by concerning pauses. Checking his pulse, she found it rapid and thready, another indication of his worsening condition. Stay with me, Tom, she whispered, using his first name for the first time since their deployment began. Your wife and daughter are waiting for you back home. Remember that gun shop you're going to open. You can't check out now. Whether he could hear her in his unconscious state was impossible to know. But Alex continued talking, providing a human connection that medical studies suggested could help even comatose patients maintain their link to life. Davis watched her with a mixture of admiration and concern. You know him well. Well enough, she replied, checking Walker's pupils again. We've been through some rough spots together. He was the first one in the unit to treat me like a soldier instead of a novelty. He told me once that having you as our medic was better than having an extra platoon, Davis said. Said you had the best hands he'd ever seen in the field. Alex managed a small smile despite the pain that accompanied every breath. He's delirious. Don't believe everything he says. The attempted humor did little to mask the gravity of their situation, but maintaining psychological resilience was as important as physical treatment in combat medicine. Fear and hopelessness killed as surely as bullets, sometimes more efficiently. Their conversation was interrupted by the distinctive crack of a high-caliber rifle. The enemy sniper had found a new firing position. The sixth bullet struck with devastating precision, hitting Alex directly in the chest where earlier damage had compromised her body armor. The impact drove her backward against the Humvee's undercarriage, the 7.62 millimeter round penetrating just below her heart before lodging against her spine. For several seconds, she couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't even process the new agony that exploded through her torso. Davis screamed her name, the sound seeming to come from very far away, as darkness encroached on her vision. Blood poured from the entry wound, soaking what remained of her uniform as her body struggled to compensate for the catastrophic new injury. Through the gathering fog of shock and blood loss, Alexandra Mitchell made a decision that defined her beyond training or duty. Drawing on reserves of will that transcended normal human limitations, she fought her way back to consciousness. Her first awareness was of Davis pressing a field dressing against her chest, wound his face contorted with determination despite his own injuries. "Stay with us, Doc. Don't you dare die on us." Applying pressure. "Good?" She managed each word, requiring monumental effort. "Need to pack the wound." Following her gasped instructions, Davis located a hemostatic agent in her medical kit and applied it to the wound cavity. The advanced clotting compound began working immediately, stemming the blood flow that would otherwise have killed her within minutes. "Good job," she whispered when the procedure was complete. "You've got medic potential." "Had a good teacher," he replied, his voice cracking. Alex forced herself to assess the new injury with clinical detachment. The bullet had caused severe damage to her right lung and possibly nicked her liver before stopping near her spine. The proximity to her spinal cord explained the alarming numbness spreading through her lower extremities, nerve compression from tissue swelling, if she was lucky, actual spinal cord damage, if she wasn't. Either way, her mobility was now severely compromised. 6 gunshot wounds had transformed her body into a battlefield itself, each system fighting to maintain essential functions against cascading failures. By any reasonable medical assessment, she should already be dead. Yet Alexandra Mitchell continued, driven by an oath that transcended self-preservation. As long as her patients needed her, she would find a way to provide care, even if that care now consisted mainly of monitoring vital signs and providing psychological support. The radio came alive with Reynolds' urgent voice. "Breakout operation commencing in 5 minutes. All units prepare for coordinated fire mission on my mark." "Captain," Alex responded, her voice alarmingly weak even to her own ears. "Be advised, my mobility is now severely restricted. New GSW to chest with possible spinal involvement." The silence that followed conveyed Reynolds' shock more effectively than words. When he finally responded, his voice carried the tight control of a commander, refusing to acknowledge the emotions threatening his tactical judgment. "Understood. We'll bring extraction equipment. Prepare patients for immediate evacuation." Alex turned to Davis, who had witnessed the entire exchange. "We need to get Walker ready to move. His cervical spine must remain immobilized during transport." "What about you?" Davis asked, the question hanging in the air between them. "I'll manage," she replied, the simple phrase encompassing a determination that defied her catastrophic injuries. Working together despite their wounds, they prepared Walker for the dangerous extraction attempt that represented their only hope of survival. Alex instructed Davis on proper immobilization techniques, improvising a cervical collar from available materials to protect Walker's spine during movement. As they completed these preparations, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting their position into shadow. The temperature began dropping rapidly, a mixed blessing that brought relief from the day's brutal heat, but introduced new risks of hypothermia for wounded soldiers already battling blood loss and shock. The 7th bullet came without warning. In the gathering dusk, a sniper shot that struck Alex in the hip, the impact spinning her sideways and eliciting the first involuntary cry of pain she had allowed herself since the ambush began. The round shattered her pelvis, destroying the ball and socket joint and severing small arteries, that immediately began pumping blood onto the dusty ground. "Doc," Davis cried out, witnessing her collapse. For several heartbeats, Alexandra Mitchell hovered on the edge of consciousness, her vision narrowing to a tunnel as her body approached the absolute limits of human endurance. 7 gunshot wounds now mapped a constellation of agony across her broken form, each one representing damage that would typically be classified as life-threatening in isolation. Combined, they created a medical impossibility, a living soldier who should, by all physiological metrics, have already succumbed to her injuries hours ago. Yet in that critical moment between surrender and survival, Alex found herself remembering Master Sergeant Wilson's words from training. The difference between a good medic and a great one isn't knowledge or skill. It's the absolute refusal to quit while your patient still has a chance. With trembling fingers, she applied a fresh combat gauze to her hip wound, the advanced hemostatic material instantly adhering to the damaged tissue and blood vessels. The procedure, performed on herself without anesthesia or assistance, represented a level of professional detachment that transcended normal human pain thresholds. "Still, with you?" She managed meeting Davis's horrified gaze with determined eyes. "Just need a minute." "Jesus Christ, Doc," he whispered. "How are you still alive, let alone conscious?" "Too stubborn to die," she replied, forcing what might have been a smile through blood-flecked lips. Mitchell family tradition. The attempt at humor fell flat against the backdrop of their desperate situation, but maintaining psychological resilience remained crucial. Fear was as deadly as bullets in combat scenarios, sometimes more so. The radio crackled with renewed activity as Reynolds coordinated the final details of their extraction attempt. American forces would create a diversionary attack on the eastern flank, hopefully drawing enemy attention away from the western corridor that had been identified as their best chance for reaching the isolated casualties. 30 seconds, Reynolds announced. "Be ready to move on my signal." Alex performed a final check on Walker's condition, still unconscious, but breathing pupils still unequal but reactive. Without immediate neurosurgical intervention, his prognosis remained grave, but he had survived longer than his injuries suggested possible. Like her, he was fighting beyond normal human limitations. "Davis," she said, her voice steadying with professional focus despite her injuries, "when they reach us, you and Walker go first. Clear." "Not without you," he replied immediately. "That's an order, Private." She rarely invoked rank, but this situation demanded clarity. "Walker's condition is time-critical. Every minute matters for his brain function." Before Davis could argue further, the night erupted with gunfire as the extraction operation commenced. The distinctive sound of M4 carbines on full automatic mingled with the heavier reports of Lawson's .50 caliber machine gun, creating a wall of sound that momentarily drowned out all other battlefield noise. Through her radio, Alex heard Reynolds directing the coordinated attack with the precision of a commander who understood that lives depended on perfect execution. Bennett maintained suppressing fire on buildings 3 and 4. Lawson focused on the sniper position. Martinez and Collins prepare for extraction run. The diversionary attack had its intended effect, drawing enemy fire away from their position as fighters responded to the immediate threat. For several precious minutes, the area around the overturned Humvee experienced a reduced hostile fire as insurgents redirected their attention to the eastern approach. "Moving to your position now," Reynolds announced. "Maintain cover." Alex tried to shift her position to provide better observation of the western approach, but her shattered hip and increasingly numb lower extremities made movement nearly impossible. Instead, she focused on preparing her sidearm, determined to provide what protection she could during the critical moments of extraction. Through the gathering darkness, she detected movement in the shadowy figures of American soldiers, using the limited cover of debris and damaged vehicles to approach their position. The extraction team had managed to navigate the gauntlet of enemy fire zones, reaching the midpoint between the divided American forces. Hope flickered briefly in her chest before experience and training reasserted control. The most dangerous phase of the operation was still ahead, the actual extraction of 3 wounded soldiers across open ground under potential enemy fire. The radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't Reynolds' voice. The English-accented commander had returned to the captured frequency, his tone betraying frustration at the Americans' continued resistance. "They're attempting extraction from the west," he informed his fighters. "Reposition to intercept. The female medic is still the primary target." The warning came too late for Alex to alert Reynolds. As the extraction team reached the halfway point to their position, a hidden machine gun opened fire from a previously unidentified position. Heavy caliber rounds chewed through the limited cover, forcing the American soldiers to retreat under the withering fire. Pulling back, Reynolds shouted through the radio. New enemy position identified, unable to reach you at this time. The brief surge of hope collapsed as Alex watched their chance for extraction dissolve under the tactical reality of superior enemy positioning. The insurgent forces had anticipated their movement, preparing contingencies that demonstrated professional military planning rather than the ad hoc responses typical of most urban fighters. Understood, she replied, her voice betraying none of the disappointment that threatened to overwhelm her professional detachment. We'll maintain position and continue treatment. As darkness fully enveloped the battlefield, the temperature continued dropping, creating new challenges for the wounded soldiers. Already compromised by blood loss and shock, their bodies struggled to maintain core temperature in the desert night chill. Hypothermia would accelerate the effects of their injuries, potentially killing them as surely as bullets if left untreated. Davis, Alex said, forcing clarity into her increasingly weak voice, we need to preserve body heat, move closer to Walker, and share warmth. What about you? I'll manage, she replied, the simple phrase encompassing a determination that defied her catastrophic injuries. Using his good arm, Davis dragged himself closer to Walker's unconscious form, providing body heat that might make the difference between survival and death as the night progressed. Alex watched with approval, noting the private's growing confidence in implementing medical directives despite his own pain and fear. The eighth bullet found her as she attempted to retrieve additional dressings from her depleted medical bag. A hidden fighter had used the darkness to maneuver closer to their position, firing a burst from an AK-47 that sent rounds pinging off the Humvee's undercarriage. One bullet penetrated the narrow gap in their cover, striking Alex in the right shoulder blade before exiting through her already damaged chest. The impact drove her forward and onto the ground, face pressed against the blood-soaked earth as fresh agony exploded through her body. For several heartbeats, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even process the new wound that had joined the constellation of trauma, already mapping her broken form. Doc Davis's voice seemed to come from very far away as darkness encroached on her vision. The cumulative effect of 8 gunshot wounds, each representing potentially fatal trauma, created a physiological crisis that pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. Yet Alexandra Mitchell refused the darkness. With a determination that transcended normal human will, she forced herself back to consciousness, dragging herself upright despite the protests of her shattered body. Still here, she gasped, blood bubbling from her lips as her damaged lungs struggled to maintain oxygen exchange. Just need pressure on the new wound. Davis stared at her with a mixture of horror and awe. How are you still functioning? It's not humanly possible. Turns out, I'm stubborn, she managed, attempting to inject humor into a situation that had transcended normal categories of combat trauma. As the night deepened over Fallujah, the sounds of battle gradually diminished across the city. The coordinated attacks that had erupted simultaneously in multiple sectors began to wane as both sides consolidated positions intended to casualties. The reduction in immediate combat activity created an eerie silence, punctuated only by occasional gunfire and the distant thump of artillery. Through it all, Staff Sergeant Alexandra Mitchell continued her vigil over the wounded men who depended on her skills. 8 bullet wounds had transformed her body into a medical impossibility, a living testament to the human will to endure beyond all rational limits. Blood loss, shock tissue, damage, and infection risk created a prognosis that no combat surgeon would have classified as survivable. Yet she remained conscious, remained functional, remained dedicated to the oath that had brought her to this blood-soaked corner of Fallujah. As long as Walker and Davis still breathed, she would find the strength to continue monitoring their conditions, adjusting their positions to optimize survival chances, and maintaining the human connection that could mean the difference between surrender and survival. The radio had fallen silent, the batteries finally depleted after hours of continuous use. Their isolation was now complete, cut off from communication with the remaining American forces surrounded by enemy fighters who had specifically targeted their position with no immediate prospect of rescue or reinforcement. In the darkness, Alex felt a strange calm descend as she assessed their situation with clinical detachment. The tactical reality was grim: 3 severely wounded soldiers with limited medical supplies, no communications, and overwhelming enemy presence. By any objective measure, their chances of survival until dawn were minimal. Yet Alexandra Mitchell had never accepted impossibility as a diagnostic category. As long as her patients showed vital signs, she would continue fighting for their survival with every remaining ounce of her strength and skill. The night stretched endlessly before them, each hour marked by the slow progression of stars across the desert sky. Periodically, she checked Walker's condition, noting with professional concern the subtle changes that indicated his intracranial pressure continued increasing despite her efforts. Without neurosurgical intervention, soon his prognosis grew increasingly dire. Davis drifted in and out of consciousness, his body battling the combined effects of blood loss, pain, and the onset of infection in his compound fracture. The tourniquet had prevented catastrophic bleeding, but the extended application time now threatened the viability of tissue distal to the injury. Between patient assessments, Alex fought her own battle against the darkness that constantly threatened to envelop her consciousness. 8 gunshot wounds leaked blood onto the ground beneath her, creating a macabre record of her position throughout the long night. By medical standards, she had already lost more blood than should allow for continued function. Yet through sheer determination, she remained awake and vigilant. The enemy commander's voice had disappeared from their vicinity, suggesting he had repositioned to coordinate operations elsewhere in the city. The fighters surrounding their position maintained containment without pressing an immediate attack content to wait for time and injuries to accomplish what bullets had not yet managed. As the first hints of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Alexandra Mitchell allowed herself a moment of grim reflection. They had survived the night against all odds, 3 critically wounded American soldiers who should by all tactical and medical assessments have already succumbed to their injuries or been overrun by superior enemy forces. Yet here they remained, still breathing, still fighting, still refusing to surrender to the statistical impossibility of their situation. In that moment, Alex understood something fundamental about human resilience that transcended her medical training. The absolute refusal to accept defeat could sometimes overcome physiological limitations that should have been insurmountable. The 9th bullet found her as the first rays of morning sun crested the horizon, casting long shadows across the blood-soaked ground where she had maintained her vigil throughout the endless night. A patient insurgent sniper waiting for first light to improve visibility fired a single precisely aimed shot that struck Alex in the lower back, the impact driving her forward onto her hands and knees. Pain erupted through her torso as the round damaged her kidney before exiting through her already compromised abdomen. Fresh blood soaked through her tattered uniform, adding to the constellation of wounds that had transformed her body into a battlefield itself. For several heartbeats, Alexandra Mitchell teetered on the edge of unconsciousness, the cumulative trauma of 9 gunshot wounds finally threatening to overcome even her extraordinary will. The world seemed to recede, sounds growing distant as darkness encroached from the periphery of her vision. In that moment, suspended between life and death, she thought of Master Sergeant Wilson's words during training. A combat medic's job isn't just to know medicine. It's to be the strongest person on the battlefield when everyone else is falling apart. With a determination that defied physiological explanation, Alex forced herself back to awareness, dragging her consciousness from the brink through sheer force of will. Trembling hands pressed fresh dressing against the new wound, stemming blood flow that her body could ill afford to lose. Still, here, she whispered to herself the words both affirmation and promise. Still fighting. The second day of their ordeal had begun, and Staff Sergeant Alexandra Mitchell had already survived wounds that should have killed her many times over. Yet the greatest test of her endurance still lay ahead, as did the bullets that would complete the tally of 11 rounds before rescue finally arrived. The second day in Fallujah dawned with merciless clarity, illuminating the grim tableau behind the overturned Humvee. Staff Sergeant Alexandra Mitchell lay in a pool of her own blood, 9 bullet wounds marking her broken body like a roadmap of suffering. Despite injuries that should have been fatal hours ago, her eyes remained open, alert, and fixed on the 2 wounded soldiers who depended entirely on her medical expertise. Sergeant Thomas Walker had survived the night, but his neurological condition continued deteriorating. Unequal pupils and irregular breathing patterns told the story that Alex understood all too well. Increasing intracranial pressure threatened permanent brain damage or death without immediate surgical intervention. Private Davis maintained consciousness intermittently, his shattered leg now showing the telltale signs of infection, heat swelling and discoloration that extended beyond the wound site. The morning sun transformed their shelter into an oven, the metal of the Humvee absorbing and radiating heat that exacerbated dehydration and accelerated infection. Water had been depleted hours ago, leaving their parched lips cracked and bleeding. Sweat evaporated almost instantly in the desert air, leaving salt crystals that stung open wounds in abraded, damaged skin. Alex performed her medical assessment with mechanical precision, despite her catastrophic injuries. The gunshot wound to her lower back had damaged her kidney, evidenced by the blood in her urine. Her shattered hip rendered her lower extremities almost completely immobile. The chest wounds had compromised both lungs, making each breath a struggle against fluid accumulation and tissue damage. Her left arm hung useless from shattered bones, while bullet wounds in her shoulder, thigh, and side leaked blood onto the already saturated ground. By any medical standard, she should have been dead long ago. Yet Alexandra Mitchell continued functioning through a combination of training determination and physiological resilience that defied explanation. Her hands, though trembling from blood loss and shock, still checked bandages and monitored vital signs with professional competence. "Davis," she called, her voice weakened but steady. "Need you awake. Status report." The wounded soldier stirred, his face gray with pain and dehydration. "Still here, Doc. Legs on fire, though. Infection setting in. Need to check the tourniquet." With tremendous effort, Alex dragged herself closer, using her one functioning arm, leaving a smear of blood across the dusty ground. The movement sent waves of agony through her multiple wound sites, but she compartmentalized the pain with practiced mental discipline. The tourniquet on Davis's leg had been in place for over 24 hours, dangerously beyond the recommended time limit. Tissue distal to the compression would be approaching irreversible damage, yet loosening it risked catastrophic bleeding from the femoral artery. "Going to loosen temporarily," she explained. "Need to allow some perfusion." Davis nodded, bracing himself. "Do what you have to, Doc." Alex carefully adjusted the tourniquet, loosening it just enough to allow minimal blood flow while maintaining pressure on the major vessels. Davis hissed through clenched teeth as circulation partially returned to the damaged limb, bringing fresh waves of pain with the blood. 30 seconds, she murmured, monitoring the wound site for renewed bleeding. Then we tighten again. The procedure, though excruciating for Davis, was necessary to preserve limb viability. As she retightened the tourniquet, Alex heard movement from Walker, a low moan that indicated increasing pain despite his semi-conscious state. Moving to his side required another agonizing effort, but she forced her broken body to comply. Walker's condition had worsened overnight, his breathing now showing the characteristic Cheney-Stokes pattern that indicated brainstem compression. Without immediate neurosurgical intervention, he would likely die within hours. "Stay with me, Tom," she whispered, adjusting his position to maximize airway clearance. "Help is coming. You just need to hold on." Whether he could hear her was impossible to know. But Alex continued speaking, providing the human connection that medical studies suggested might reach patients even in deep unconsciousness. Through the morning hours, the tactical situation remained unchanged. Enemy fighters maintained positions surrounding their location, occasional sniper fire keeping the American forces pinned in separate positions across the neighborhood. The coordinated citywide attack had clearly stretched American resources beyond capacity, preventing immediate rescue operations for isolated units like theirs. Without functioning radio communications, Alex had no way of knowing what rescue efforts might be underway. Her world had narrowed to the few square meters behind the Humvee, her universe consisting entirely of maintaining life functions in 3 critically wounded soldiers, including herself. Around midday, a distinctive sound cut through the ambient battlefield noise, the unmistakable engine signature of an AC-30 gunship circling at high altitude. The specialized aircraft represented one of the most devastating weapons in the American arsenal, capable of delivering precision fire support with its array of cannons and howitzers. "Hear that, Davis?" Alex managed, her voice strengthening slightly. "Spooky's on station. They're bringing in the heavy hitters." Davis tilted his head, listening to the distant aircraft. "That's going to make those bastards think twice." The presence of the AC-130 immediately altered the tactical dynamic. Enemy fire diminished significantly as fighters sought better cover from the aircraft's devastating observational capabilities and firepower. For the first time in over 30 hours, the constant threat of incoming rounds temporarily abated. The strategic shift brought a flicker of hope, but Alex's medical training prevented unwarranted optimism. The gunship's arrival improved their tactical situation, but did nothing to address the critical medical conditions deteriorating by the minute. Walker's brain injury, Davis's infection, and her own catastrophic trauma required advanced treatment that could only be provided at a proper medical facility. The sound of distant explosions confirmed the AC-130 had begun engaging enemy positions. Systematic destruction, creating potential corridors for ground forces to maneuver. Whether those corridors would lead to their position remained uncertain, but the coordinated air attack represented the first positive development since the ambush began. As afternoon heat reached its peak, Alex noticed Walker's breathing pattern changing, becoming more shallow and irregular, with longer pauses between breaths. The ominous sign indicated his brainstem function was becoming compromised by increasing pressure. With desperate resolve, she performed a crude neurological assessment, checking his pupillary response and pain reaction. Neither showed the responses she hoped for. Walker was slipping away despite her best efforts to keep him alive. "No," she whispered, the single word encompassing her refusal to accept his imminent death. "Not after all this. Not when help is finally coming." Using knowledge normally reserved for emergency room physicians, Alex made a critical decision. Without proper medications or equipment, she would attempt a last resort procedure to reduce intracranial pressure. Using a needle from her depleted medical kit, she prepared to perform a rudimentary ventricular drainage, creating a small opening that might relieve the pressure crushing Walker's brain. "Davis," she called, "I need your steady hands again." The wounded soldier dragged himself closer. "What are we doing, Doc?" "Something they definitely didn't teach in basic training," she replied, her voice carrying the grim determination of a medical professional making impossible choices under impossible conditions. With precise instructions, she guided Davis through the delicate procedure, identifying the correct entry point and angle for the needle. The makeshift intervention carried extreme risks of infection and brain damage, but doing nothing guaranteed Walker's death within the hour. "Easy now," she murmured as Davis's shaking hands positioned the needle. "Steady pressure. Stop the moment you feel resistance change." The crude procedure, performed in battlefield conditions that would horrify any neurosurgeon, represented the desperate measures of a combat medic exceeding all normal parameters of field medicine. When completed, they had no way of knowing if they had helped or harmed Walker's condition. Only time would reveal the outcome. "You did good," Alex told Davis, recognizing the immense psychological strain of performing such a procedure without proper training. "Whatever happens, you gave him his only chance." As afternoon transitioned into early evening, a new sound joined the battlefield symphony, the distinctive thump of artillery rounds impacting in a systematic pattern around the neighborhood. The precision barrage indicated fire support was being coordinated to suppress enemy positions throughout the area. "They're prepping the battlefield," Alex explained to Davis, her professional knowledge providing context for the tactical developments. "Suppressing known enemy positions before attempting ground movement." "For extraction?" Davis asked, hope evident in his voice for the first time in hours. "Possibly. Or repositioning for a larger operation." She didn't add the obvious caveat that such preparation didn't guarantee they would be reached in time to save Walker, or possibly even themselves. The artillery continued for nearly 30 minutes, methodical destruction reshaping the urban terrain around them. When it finally ceased, an eerie silence descended over Fallujah, broken only by the distant crackling of fires and occasional secondary explosions from ammunition caches ignited by the bombardment. In that relative quiet, Alex heard movement nearby, careful, deliberate footsteps approaching from the western side of their position. Military training immediately heightened her awareness, hand moving to the sidearm that had remained her last line of defense throughout the ordeal. "American forces," a voice called from beyond their limited visual range. "Identify yourselves." For a moment, Alex feared a trap, insurgents attempting to draw them out or confirm their exact position. Her caution was justified given the sophisticated tactics the enemy had already demonstrated. "Staff Sergeant Alexandra Mitchell, Alpha Company," she responded, keeping her voice low enough to avoid giving away their precise location. "Two wounded soldiers requiring immediate medical evacuation." "Authentication phrase Delta Bravo 7, the voice challenged, using standard military protocols to verify friendly forces. Alex provided the correct response. Without hesitation, the countermeasures against enemy deception drilled into all combat personnel. Echo Sierra 39er. The exchange completed, a shadowy figure emerged from behind a collapsed wall 20 meters from their position. The soldier wore the distinctive gear of Special Operations Forces, advanced body armor, specialized weapons, and night vision equipment, despite the remaining daylight. "SEAL Team," The figure identified himself as he approached cautiously, still scanning for threats. Lieutenant Commander Nathan Reed, we've been looking for you for 12 hours. As he reached their position, Reed's professional composure momentarily faltered at the scene before him. Alexandra Mitchell lay in a pool of blood, her uniform so thoroughly soaked that its original color was unrecognizable. 9 distinct bullet wounds marked her body, each one representing potentially fatal trauma. Yet she remained conscious, alert, and actively providing medical care to the 2 wounded soldiers beside her. "My God," Reed whispered, activating his tactical radio. "Sullivan, get up here now. Multiple casualties, 1 critical medic with—" He paused, visually counting the wound sites. At least 9 GSWs, still conscious and functioning. Within minutes, additional SEAL team members materialized from multiple approaches, securing the perimeter as their medical specialists rushed to assess the wounded. Petty Officer Jason Sullivan, the team's senior corpsman with advanced combat medical training, knelt beside Alex with an expression that balanced professional assessment with undisguised amazement. Staff Sergeant, he began quickly cataloging her injuries. "How long have you been providing care in this condition?" "Approximately 36 hours, she replied, her voice steadying with the arrival of fellow medical personnel. "Walker has severe TBI with signs of herniation. Performed emergency pressure relief 20 minutes ago. Davis has compound femoral fracture with vascular compromise and developing infection. Tourniquet has been in place with periodic loosening since yesterday morning." Sullivan stared at her for a heartbeat, processing not just the medical information, but the extraordinary circumstances of its delivery, a critically wounded medic who should have died hours ago, still providing detailed patient reports and prioritizing others' care over her own. "And you?" he finally asked, already unpacking advanced medical supplies from his tactical kit. "Multiple GSWs, she stated with clinical detachment. Bilateral pneumothorax, kidney involvement, hip fracture, spinal proximity on lower back wound, shattered left humerus, probable liver laceration, significant blood loss." The matter-of-fact recitation of catastrophic injuries delivered with the professional tone of a physician discussing someone else's case struck Sullivan with its surreal quality. In 15 years as a combat medic, including multiple special operations deployments, he had never encountered anyone who remained functional with such extensive trauma. "Ma'am," he said, the formal address conveying profound respect. "By all medical standards, you should have been dead a day ago." A ghost of a smile crossed Alex's blood-cracked lips. "Apparently, I'm too stubborn for standards." Reed rejoined them after establishing the security perimeter. "Medevac is inbound, but we need to move to a proper LZ. This position is too constrained for helicopter extraction." "Walker can't be moved without proper spinal stabilization," Alex responded immediately. "And Davis needs IV antibiotics before transport to prevent septic shock." Sullivan was already implementing these measures, establishing IV access on both wounded soldiers, while another team member prepared specialized extraction equipment. The rapid, coordinated response of the Special Operations Team stood in stark contrast to the desperate isolation of the previous 36 hours. "And you, Staff Sergeant?" Reed asked quietly. "I'll manage," she replied, the simple phrase encompassing a determination that had already transcended normal human limitations. Sullivan administered medications through newly established IV lines, the potent combination of antibiotics, analgesics, and fluid replacement beginning the medical stabilization process. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, each action precise despite the challenging field conditions. Sullivan, Reed called after receiving updated information through his radio. "Choppers are 15 minutes out. Landing zone is secure, but we need to move now to make the window." The medical specialist nodded, completing his immediate interventions. "Walker is packaged for transport. Davis is stabilized for movement. Mitchell needs pressure dressings reinforced before we attempt transport." As Sullivan worked to prepare Alex for movement, applying fresh combat gauze to wounds that had been bleeding for over a day, the specialized extraction equipment was positioned. Walker, with his critical neurological status, was carefully transferred to a tactical stretcher with cervical stabilization. Davis, his infected leg immobilized, was helped onto a collapsible transport chair carried by one of the SEAL operators. "Ready for Mitchell," Sullivan announced, finishing the temporary reinforcement of her multiple wound sites. 2 SEAL team members positioned themselves beside Alex, preparing to lift her onto the remaining stretcher. As they began the movement, a sudden burst of gunfire erupted from a building to the east, a last desperate attack by insurgent fighters who had remained hidden during the artillery barrage. The 10th bullet caught Alex in the upper chest as the SEAL operators attempted to shield her with their bodies. The impact drove the air from her lungs, blood immediately bubbling from her lips as the round created yet another wound in her already devastated torso. "Man down!" Reed shouted, returning fire while the medical evacuation continued under combat conditions. Sullivan immediately applied pressure to the new wound, his expression betraying the grim assessment this 10th injury might finally accomplish what the previous 9 had not. The bullet had struck dangerously close to Alex's heart, the blood flow suggesting possible arterial involvement. "Stay with us, Staff Sergeant," he urged, administering emergency medications through the IV line he had established minutes earlier. "You've made it this far. Don't quit now." Alex's vision tunneled as shock deepened the cumulative effect of 10 gunshot wounds, finally threatening to overcome even her extraordinary resilience. The world seemed to recede, sounds becoming distant as darkness encroached from the periphery. Through the gathering fog, she heard Sullivan's voice, professional but tinged with genuine concern. "BP's dropping. Pulse thready and irregular. We need immediate transport." With practiced efficiency, the SEAL team completed the extraction under fire, moving all 3 casualties toward the designated landing zone approximately 200 meters west of their position. Reed and 2 operators provided covering fire, suppressing the remaining insurgent positions as the medical team maintained movement. Alex drifted in and out of consciousness during the transport, each jostling step sending fresh waves of agony through her bullet-riddled body. The world seemed to strobe between darkness and blinding desert sunlight, fragments of sensation and sound penetrating the encroaching void. Sullivan's voice remained a constant, professional commands interspersed with personal encouragement. "Stay with us, Mitchell. Chopper's almost here. You've done the impossible already, just a little longer." The distinctive sound of helicopter rotors cut through the battlefield noise as the medical evacuation aircraft approached. The MH-60 Blackhawk, specially modified for combat search and rescue, descended toward the secured landing zone with the practiced precision of pilots accustomed to operating under hostile conditions. "Hot loading," Reed shouted over the rotor wash as the helicopter maintained a hover, rather than fully landing, a tactical decision that minimized exposure time in the unsecured area. Walker was loaded first, his critical neurological status making him the highest priority for immediate transport. Davis followed, helped aboard by SEAL team members who had maintained security throughout the extraction. As Alex was being transferred to the helicopter, the 11th and final bullet found her. A desperate shot from a distant building struck her in the lower back, the impact barely registered among the constellation of agony already mapping her broken body. Only Sullivan's sharp intake of breath and immediate pressure on the new wound site indicated the hit. "Final patient loaded," Sullivan reported as they secured Alex's stretcher in the aircraft. Multiple GSWs, critical condition requiring immediate surgical intervention. The Blackhawk lifted off, banking sharply to avoid potential ground fire as it climbed to safer altitude. Inside the aircraft, the medical team worked feverishly to stabilize 3 critically wounded soldiers for the flight to the combat support hospital in Baghdad. Advanced monitoring equipment now confirmed what had been obvious through visual assessment. Alexandra Mitchell's condition defied medical explanation. BP 80/40, pulse 140, and irregular oxygen saturation 82%. A flight medic reported attaching additional IV lines to deliver plasma and emergency medications. 11 confirmed GSWs with massive tissue damage and blood loss. Sullivan, still applying pressure to the most recent wounds, shook his head in disbelief. "She was providing medical care to the others right up until we arrived. I've never seen anything like it." "Will she make it?" the pilot asked through the intercom. Sullivan met Alex's gaze, her eyes somehow still open, still aware despite injuries that should have been fatal many times over. If anyone can, it's her. The 50-minute flight to Baghdad represented the most advanced phase of medical care Alex had received since the ambush began. The helicopter's medical equipment, while limited compared to a proper hospital, provided crucial interventions that stabilized her condition enough for transport. Through it all, Alexandra Mitchell maintained tenuous consciousness, her extraordinary will to survive extending beyond all rational medical expectations. When they finally touched down at the Combat Support Hospital, the waiting trauma team rushed to meet the aircraft led by Major Elizabeth Morgan, the facility's chief surgeon. "What have we got?" Morgan asked as the first stretcher was unloaded. "Staff Sergeant Alexandra Mitchell," Sullivan reported. 11 gunshot wounds sustained over approximately 36 hours. Maintained medical care for 2 other casualties despite her injuries until extraction. Morgan's expression reflected professional shock as she quickly assessed the extent of trauma. 11 GSWs and she's still alive. "Yes, ma'am." defies medical explanation. As they rushed Alex into the trauma bay, a weak voice emerged from the blood-soaked stretcher. Walker, Davis, need immediate. We've got them, Staff Sergeant. Morgan assured her, amazed that patient advocacy remained Alex's priority despite her catastrophic condition. All three of you are receiving the best care now. You can stand down. For the first time in nearly 40 hours, Alexandra Mitchell allowed herself to relinquish responsibility for the wounded soldiers who had depended on her skills. As the trauma team began cutting away what remained of her uniform to access the multiple wound sites, she finally surrendered to the darkness that had threatened to engulf her consciousness since that first bullet struck her shoulder the previous morning. The emergency surgery lasted 18 hours, requiring the combined expertise of 6 specialist surgeons working in careful coordination. The extent of damage seemed almost impossible to repair. 11 separate gunshot wounds, each representing life-threatening trauma, distributed across a body that had already endured blood loss and physical stress beyond normal human tolerance. I've never seen anything like this, Dr. Morgan commented during a brief pause between procedures. By all medical standards, she should have died after the 3rd or 4th wound, let alone functioning with all 11. The SEAL corpsman said she was still providing care to the others when they found her, another surgeon replied, giving detailed medical reports and treatment recommendations despite her condition. Morgan shook her head in disbelief. That goes beyond training or duty. That's something else entirely. 3 months later, at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C., Alexandra Mitchell opened her eyes to find Master Sergeant Frank Wilson sitting beside her bed. The gruff training instructor, who had once doubted her abilities, now wore an expression of uncharacteristic gentleness. About time you rejoined the land of the living, Mitchell, he said, his voice lacking its usual commanding edge. 43 days in a coma. Always have to overachieve, don't you? Alex attempted to speak, but her throat was too dry from prolonged intubation. Wilson carefully helped her with a small ice chip, the simple kindness so at odds with his training persona that it momentarily confused her drug-hazed mind. Walker and Davis, she finally managed the question, emerging as a hoarse whisper. Both alive thanks to you, Wilson replied. Walker's got some ongoing neurological issues, but making good progress in rehab. Doctors say that makeshift pressure relief procedure you performed likely saved his life and prevented permanent brain damage. Davis kept his leg touch and go for a while with the infection, but he's walking with a cane now. Relief washed over Alex's features, the news providing more healing than any medication. After a moment, she asked, "How bad was I?" Wilson met her gaze directly. "Mitchell, you've rewritten medical textbooks. 11 gunshot wounds, catastrophic blood loss, multiple organ injuries. You were clinically dead twice during surgery. The medical journal articles are already being published." He reached into his pocket, removing a small box. "The president will be presenting this himself when you're stronger, but I wanted you to see it first." Inside lay the Silver Star, one of the highest decorations for valor in combat. "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action," Wilson recited from memory. While critically wounded, Staff Sergeant Mitchell continued providing life-saving medical care to fellow soldiers for 36 hours under enemy fire, sustaining 11 separate gunshot wounds while refusing to abandon her patients. Alex stared at the metal memories of those desperate hours behind the overturned Humvee, flooding back in fragmentary images. "I was just doing my job." "No," Wilson corrected gently. "You went so far beyond your job that they're creating new training protocols based on your actions. The Mitchell protocols, they're calling them, for extreme casualty scenarios when normal medical guidelines no longer apply." He leaned closer, his weathered face solemn. "Remember when I gave you my father's combat medical badge? Told you that you might be one of the great ones." Alex nodded slightly, the movement sending pain through her still healing body. "I was wrong," Wilson said, his voice thick with emotion he rarely displayed. "You're not one of the great ones. You've set a standard no one else may ever reach." 6 months later, Alexandra Mitchell stood before a classroom of medical trainees at Fort Sam Houston, her body still bearing the scars of 11 bullet wounds. The extensive rehabilitation had been grueling, learning to walk again, regaining function in her damaged arm, adapting to the permanent effects of injuries that should have been fatal. Yet here she stood, not merely surviving, but teaching, passing on the knowledge that could only be gained through extraordinary experience. The room fell silent as she began speaking, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had faced the impossible and prevailed. "Combat medicine isn't about being a hero," she told the attentive students. "It's about remembering your oath when everything is falling apart around you. It's about making impossible decisions under impossible conditions. She moved slowly to the whiteboard, the slight limp a permanent reminder of her shattered hip. The textbook will tell you what should work in ideal conditions. I'm here to teach you what actually works when nothing is ideal. A young trainee raised his hand. Staff Sergeant, how did you keep functioning with so many critical injuries? Wasn't there a point when you thought about giving up? Alex considered the question carefully before answering. Giving up was never an option because it wasn't about me. Walker and Davis needed a medical professional to survive, and I was the only one available. Sometimes duty is that simple. She didn't mention the moments of despair, the periods when consciousness slipped away, only to be reclaimed through sheer determination, the pain that had transcended normal human experience. Those were private memories that belonged to the battlefield, not the classroom. As the session ended, she noticed a familiar figure entering the back of the room, Sergeant Thomas Walker, walking with a cane but very much alive. Beside him stood Private First Class Robert Davis, his gait still affected by the reconstructed leg, but steadily improving. No words were necessary as the three survivors of that blood-soaked corner of Fallujah shared a moment of silent recognition. They had experienced something beyond normal human endurance, a testament to the extraordinary depths of human resilience when pushed beyond all reasonable limits. Alexandra Mitchell had taken 11 rounds in Fallujah, and when the SEALs arrived 2 days later, she was still breathing, still fighting, still refusing to surrender to the impossible. The scars that mapped her body would forever tell that story, not of superhuman ability, but of the ordinary human spirit pushed to its absolute limits by extraordinary circumstances. And that was a lesson worth teaching.